The first time I saw him, it was pouring rain. The kind that doesn't just soak you, but pounds the world into submission, drumming on the windows of the hotel like a heartbeat. He stood there in the dim lobby, a tall man in a rumpled coat, his hat pulled low over his face. The kind of man who wants to be invisible, forgotten. He was checking into room 1046. I remember because there was something off about him. It wasn't the way he spoke, polite but clipped, nor the way he never once glanced at the people around him. No, it was his eyes, the brief glimpse I caught as he looked up from the registration book. Eyes that were too dark, too hollow, as if they'd seen something that had hollowed out his soul and left only that empty shell. That was 3 days ago. I've worked at the hotel for almost 10 years now, and nothing surprises me anymore. The transient crowd that wanders through, drifters, businessmen, affairs, all of it blends together in the stale air of cigarette smoke and cheap perfume. But there was something about him, something in the way he vanished into the elevator and never came out. Not for food, not for air, not even for a smoke. Then the calls started. At first they were harmless enough. The phone would ring, and when I picked it up, there would be nothing but silence. It happened sometimes, crossed wires or pranksters. But then the ringing became more persistent, the dead air more suffocating. 3 nights into his stay, I was working the night shift alone. The lobby was empty, the rain from before a faint memory outside the windows, leaving the streets soaked in reflection. It was around 2 a.m. when the call came. The front desk phone rang, and I answered, expecting the usual nothing. But this time there was a voice. Soft, but sharp enough to cut through the static. Room 1046, it said, a whispering command. Help him! The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could hear something else behind the voice. Something like heavy breathing, almost animalistic. I looked at the receiver in my hand, then up at the wall where the row of keys hung. 1046 was still checked in. But something wasn't right. The room had been deathly quiet for days. Against my better judgment, I grabbed the key. I told myself it was my job, my responsibility to check on the guests. But as I walked down the long, dimly lit hallway, that sense of duty turned into dread. The walls seemed to press in, the old hotel groaning with every step I took. The light above flickered as I passed under it, casting my shadow like a black smear on the peeling wallpaper. I stopped outside room 1046. The air was colder here, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, no matter how warm the building is. I knocked once, twice, nothing. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight. At first glance, it looked empty, bed made, no personal belongings anywhere. But then I saw him, sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to me, head lowered like he was staring at his hands. "Sir?" My voice came out shaky, barely more than a whisper. He didn't respond, didn't even flinch. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. It was hard to breathe, like the room itself was holding its breath. I stepped inside, the floor creaking underfoot. I moved closer, close enough to see the blood. His hands, they were drenched in it, dripping onto the worn carpet. Thick, dark blood pooled at his feet, the smell of iron hanging in the air like a shroud. But there were no wounds, no sign of where it came from. He just sat there, staring at his hands, as if they belonged to someone else. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest. I was about to bolt when he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It won't let me leave," he said. "It's here, watching." Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me with a violent bang, as if it had been kicked by something far stronger than a gust of wind. The sound reverberated through the walls, shaking the entire room. I spun around, but no one was there. Just the door. Closed, locked. The key still in the lock on the outside. And then I heard it. The breathing. Low, ragged, coming from the corner of the room. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting into knots. There was nothing there. Just shadows. But the shadows moved. They shifted, creeping along the walls like something alive, something waiting. The man on the bed began to shake, his voice rising in terror. "Please," he rasped. "Make it stop!" Before I could respond, the shadows lunged. They moved so fast, a blur of blackness, and then he was screaming. His body convulsed, lifted off the bed as if something was dragging him, tearing him apart. Blood splattered across the walls, the sheets, my hands. His screams piercing the air like nails on glass. And then, silence. I was frozen, paralyzed by the horror in front of me. His body lay twisted on the bed, unrecognizable. The shadows had retreated, but the room felt different now. Darker, hungrier. The phone rang. I stared at it, the shrill sound cutting through the silence. I didn't want to answer it, but my feet moved on their own, dragging me toward the desk. My fingers trembled as I picked up the receiver, blood still slick on my hands. The same voice from before. Only this time, it wasn't soft. "You're next." The line went dead. I didn't sleep after that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blood, the shadows, the twisted remains of the man in room 1046. And the voice. That voice echoed in my skull like a chant, over and over. "You're next." When the police came, they found the room in perfect condition. Not a drop of blood. No body. No sign of a struggle. The man's belongings were gone, vanished like he had never even existed. I tried to explain what I had seen, the blood, the phone calls, the shadows, but they looked at me like I was insane, like I was the one who had snapped. Maybe I was, but the nightmares didn't stop. For the next few nights, I kept myself busy, cleaning the lobby, organizing the key rack, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to that room. But every time I walked past the hallway that led to 1046, I felt it. That cold, creeping sensation of being watched. Like the air was thicker in that part of the hotel, heavy with something I couldn't explain. Then the calls started again. It was my third night back on shift. The lobby was quiet. The usual hum of distant traffic outside barely audible. I was reading a magazine, trying to pretend everything was normal, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it all. The phone rang. I stared at it for a long moment, my stomach lurching. The shrill tone cut through the silence, each ring getting louder, more insistent. I reached for the receiver, my hand trembling as I brought it to my ear. Nothing. Just that same dead air, thick and suffocating, like someone was holding their breath on the other end of the line. I swallowed hard. "Hello?" For a moment there was only silence, and then, faintly, I heard it. A whisper, so low it was almost drowned out by the static. "Room 1046. I slammed the phone down, heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't possible. There was no one in that room. There couldn't be. The police had cleared it, scrubbed it of any trace of the horror I'd witnessed. But something was in there. I could feel it. I stood up, my legs shaky, and grabbed the master key. My gut screamed at me to stay away, to leave that cursed room alone. But I had to know. I had to see for myself. Maybe it was some sick prank, someone trying to mess with me. Or maybe... I didn't want to think about what else it could be. The hallway stretched out in front of me, darker than usual. The lights above flickered weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and shift as I approached room 1046. The cold was back, biting into my skin, wrapping around me like icy fingers. I stood outside the door, the key in my hand. My pulse was racing, each beat thudding in my ears like a drum. For a moment, I considered turning around, walking back to the safety of the lobby. But then the door creaked, just a little, like something was inviting me inside. With a deep breath, I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door swung open on its own, the hinges groaning like they hadn't been used in years. The room was dark, pitch black, the kind of black that swallows you whole. My hand fumbled for the light switch, but it wasn't there, just an empty wall. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. A figure standing by the window, silhouetted against the faint glow of the city lights outside. The same figure from before. The man from the bed. But this time he wasn't sitting. He was standing, perfectly still, his back to me, head slightly cocked as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Sir?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the thundering in my chest. He didn't move. Just stood there, silent as if he hadn't heard me. I took a step closer, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The smell hit me first, rotting, decayed, like something had been left to die in the walls. I gagged, covering my mouth, my eyes watering as I forced myself to move closer. "Sir?" I tried again, louder this time. His head jerked just slightly, and then the breathing started. Heavy, labored, like someone struggling for air. It wasn't coming from him. It was coming from behind me. I froze. The air in the room shifted, the temperature dropping so fast that I could see my breath clouding in front of me. I could hear it now, louder, closer, the sound of something moving, something breathing in the darkness. Slowly, I turned my head, my heart hammering against my ribs. The door was gone. Not closed, not slammed shut. Gone. The hallway, the walls, everything outside the room had vanished, replaced by a black void. And then I felt it, something cold, icy fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I whipped around, but there was nothing. Nothing but that man, still standing by the window, still not moving. And then, slowly, he turned. I wish I could say he had a face, that I could describe what I saw, but there was nothing. Just darkness, like a void where his features should have been. And yet, I could feel him watching me. I could feel the weight of his gaze, like it was boring into my soul. He took a step toward me. I backed up, stumbling, my hand reaching for the door that wasn't there. Another step. The shadows on the walls began to writhe, like something alive, something hungry. They stretched out, long tendrils of black reaching for me, curling around my ankles, my wrists. Another step. I screamed. The sound ripped from my throat as the shadows tightened their grip, dragging me toward the bed, toward him. The last thing I saw before everything went black was his hand, reaching out, his fingers coated in blood. And then, silence. When I woke up, I was back in the lobby, but something was wrong. The phone was ringing again, and my hands were covered in blood. I didn't answer the phone. I couldn't. It was the same shrill ring, the same haunting sound that had followed me from the hotel. It echoed through my apartment, rattling the very air around me, but I stood frozen, my bloodied hands trembling at my sides. It was back. The entity, the thing from room 1046, it was here. I could feel it, lurking just beyond my vision, watching me with that empty, void-like face. My breath came in shallow gasps as the phone rang again, each time louder than the last. It was no longer a question of whether I would answer. It was only a matter of how long I could resist. Don't pick it up, I told myself. Don't let it in. But something inside me, some deeper pull, some ancient terror that had latched onto me ever since that night in the hotel, compelled my hand to move. It was like I wasn't even in control anymore. My fingers wrapped around the receiver, the cold plastic feeling heavier than it should have. I lifted it to my ear, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. There was no voice this time, just breathing. Ragged, shallow breathing that scraped through the line like nails on glass. And then, something worse. A whisper, so faint it barely registered over the static. Look behind you. My blood ran cold. Every instinct screamed at me not to turn around, to drop the phone and run, to flee this place and never stop. But the air in the room was thick now, suffocating, pressing against me. And the smell, oh God, that smell. The rotting stench of decay, the same odor I'd encountered in room 1046, was filling my apartment, growing stronger with each breath I took. Slowly, against my will, I turned. At first, the room was empty. Just my apartment, as it had always been. The sunlight still streamed through the blinds, casting long, warm rays across the floor. But then I saw it, the shadow. It was there, crouched in the far corner, the same twisting, writhing darkness that had filled the hotel room. The shadows moved unnaturally, bending and folding in ways that defied logic, and in the center of it, the figure began to emerge. Tall, gaunt, limbs too long, fingers too sharp. It unfurled itself like some grotesque thing rising from the depths, its void-like face turning toward me. No, I whispered, backing away. This isn't real. This can't be real. But it was. The entity moved slowly, deliberately, its movements like water slipping through cracks. It hovered just above the floor, gliding toward me, its long skeletal fingers stretching out as if to claim what was already its. You've been marked, it rasped, the words scraping through the air. It's always been you. I stumbled back, my knees hitting the edge of the couch. My body refused to obey. I couldn't run, couldn't hide. All I could do was watch as it came closer. That gaping, empty face drawing nearer, pulling the very light from the room as it approached. Why? I gasped, barely able to breathe as it loomed over me. Why me? It tilted its head as if considering the question. And then, from somewhere deep within that void, it spoke. Because you let it in. I didn't understand at first. What had I let in? What had I done to deserve this? But then, in a flash, the memories came rushing back. The phone calls. The whispers. The warnings. Each time I had answered. Each time I had opened the door. First in the hotel and now here in my own home. It had been waiting for me to let it in. I had invited it. And now it was claiming what it had come for. No! I screamed, scrambling backward, my back hitting the wall. Stay away! But it didn't stop. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, the air crackling with something old and malevolent. Its fingers brushed against my skin, cold as death, and I felt the world begin to spin, the edges of my vision blurring as everything faded into black. And then, the worst part, the part that made my skin crawl, the part that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It wasn't me that it had come for. The darkness shifted, and from the shadows behind it, another figure emerged. A body, twisted and broken, dragged from the abyss, bloodied, torn apart. My own face, staring back at me. My own lifeless eyes, wide with terror, my mouth hanging open in a silent scream. I was dead. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This entire time I hadn't been the survivor. I hadn't escaped. I had died back there in room 1046. The thing had taken me, ripped me apart, and left behind only this hollow shell of what I once was. And now here I was, standing in the afterlife, or worse, in some purgatory between life and death. The entity had been watching me all along, guiding me back to the truth I had refused to see. I was never going to escape. The entity leaned in closer, its void of a face inches from mine, and then it whispered softly, almost tenderly, "Welcome home." And with that, the darkness swallowed me whole. The last thing I felt before everything faded into oblivion was the cold, skeletal hand closing around my throat, dragging me back into the endless night.